Hello, and welcome to my presentation on formative assessment. Today I'm going to be talking about how formative assessment can be beneficial for both teacher and student. We're going to talk a little bit about what formative assessment is, and I'm also going to give you some examples of different strategies that you can use and also how you can incorporate 21st century skills as you incorporate formative assessment into your classroom. So thanks so much for watching today, and I hope you enjoy. So before we get started, we're going to ask this question. What is formative assessment? Everybody hears this term. It's thrown around in educational circles a lot today. But what I'd like you to do is go ahead and grab a note card or a piece of scratch paper, notebook paper, whatever you got lying around, pen, pencil, and go ahead and as soon as I finish giving instructions here, pause the video. Take like 30 seconds and jot down everything that comes to your mind when you think of formative assessment. Maybe you have an idea of what that definition already looks like. Maybe you know of some examples or things that you're already using in your classroom or you've seen other teachers use. Whatever the case may be, jot it all down. Don't worry, obviously no one's going to be grading this or reading your work, so it just has to be legible for you. Use shorthand, pictures, whatever works for you to understand what you're talking about. So remember, you're going to pause the video and then you're going to take around 30 seconds to jot down everything that you know about formative assessment. Are you ready? Okay, go ahead and pause the video. Did you do it? What were some of the things that you came up with when you thought of formative assessment? Maybe you thought about the word assessment. We hear that term most often applied to things like tests and quizzes and projects and papers. Well, all of that falls into this category of summative assessment. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of teachers think about when we think of assessment. It's what we've had a lot of practice doing, it's what we were used to as students. And summative assessment is great. It tells us whether students learned at the end of a unit of study. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell us how students are doing as they move through the unit. Because remember, a unit might be a week or a couple of days or it might be a month. And if you go that long without understanding where your students are at, then when students don't do well on a summative assessment, how are you going to be able to understand what went wrong and how you could have fixed things as a teacher as you were going through? Perhaps there were places that should have had some reteaching or a different way to do something explained. That's where formative assessment comes in. Formative assessments provide ongoing, developmentally appropriate assessments to monitor children's progress and guide as well as improve instructional practice. Basically, what that means is that formative assessments are things that happen throughout the course of the unit, and they give feedback beneficial to both the teacher and the student. For the teacher, it lets us know how are we doing as teachers, and for the student, it lets them know how am I doing as a student? How am I processing this material? How am I understanding? And when we use formative assessment correctly, it does provide benefits to both students and teachers and helps improve the overall learning process. Here's another way to think about it. Take a look at this quote. When the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. When the customer tastes the soup, that's summative assessment. Makes sense, right? As the soup is being cooked, it's going through the process. The cook tastes it to know what he or she needs to add, take away next time they do it, that kind of thing. And when the customer tastes the soup, it's done. There's nothing else that can happen, although I guess the customer could add some salt and pepper. But for the most part, it's finished, the end, done. What would happen if the cook didn't taste the soup? Think about that for a minute. We see it on like every cooking show that we've ever watched where the contestant gets berated by the judge or the show's host or whatever the case may be because he or she didn't taste what they were cooking. And then if they had, they would have known it was too salty or it was raw or whatever the case may be. And if you as a customer got something that was horrible and said, well, didn't the chef taste the food? And found out they didn't, wouldn't you as a customer be pretty upset? Your reaction would not be a positive one because you would feel the cook obviously didn't do his job very well. Well, we sometimes do that as teachers when it comes to assessment. It's very typical for teachers to do summative assessments. We look at the test, we see that kids did or didn't do well, and then we judge whether they learned or didn't learn the material based on that summative assessment. But are we really doing our job if we aren't tasting along the way? If we aren't giving that formative assessment along the way to say, students really aren't understanding this concept. What can I do as a teacher? Maybe I need to reteach, or maybe I need to utilize a different learning strategy to share this concept with my students. As teachers, we are the cooks in this scenario, and it's our responsibility to make sure that the soup turns out well and that our students learn what they're supposed to learn. So now that we understand a little bit about what formative assessment is, how it's different from summative assessment, let's talk about the benefits that it brings to both us as teachers and then to our students. Formative assessment has a lot of different benefits for teachers. For example, as seen in this article, 3 Reasons That Savvy District Leaders Prioritize Formative Assessment, it said common educator challenges center around 3 key issues: gathering timely, usable data to drive instruction, meeting each student where he or she is ready to learn, and helping students cultivate higher order thinking skills. So, there's already 3 benefits listed right there to utilizing formative assessment in our classrooms. First of all, it gives us feedback as teachers, and it's timely and usable to us. A summative assessment that tells us that students didn't learn doesn't tell us how our lesson was or wasn't effective 3 days ago. When we utilize formative assessment in our regular ongoing day-to-day teaching, we're able to get data that is timely to us, that allows us to make changes immediately as we go through the process of self-reflection as teachers. It also allows us to meet each student where he or she is at and allows for differentiation for us as we move through our teaching process. We have all kinds of different students that are sitting in our classrooms today, and many of them have prior background knowledge that affects what they are learning in our classrooms. And through the use of formative assessment, we're able to see and recognize those differences much sooner than if we only see them in summative assessment. And it allows us to see where students are excelling. Perhaps they're doing really well and we're over teaching a particular aspect because we think that they don't understand it, when really they do. Or perhaps there are certain students who are struggling because there's some sort of lack of prior knowledge that we need to stop and address before we can move forward. And also, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in this presentation, formative assessment does help utilize opportunities for cultivating higher level thinking skills. And like I said, I'll address that a little later. Marzano said that the most powerful single innovation that enhances achievement is feedback. And we can see this. When students are given continuous data about how they're doing, it provides them motivation to continue moving forward in the process. They want to see themselves develop and get better because they know that, hey, I'm doing this really well. Here's how I can get that much better. Think about a coach that goes through the process of practicing with their students and gives them feedback. Here's how you can dribble faster. Here's how you can score better. You can tell that sports isn't really my thing, but you get the idea. Coaches give a lot of that formative feedback. If they only told players how to play better during a game, then their players would never actually improve. They would continue to struggle because they can't make use of that motivation from their coach only in the game. And lastly, data-driven instruction is a huge buzzword in educational circles today. And like I said, formative assessment already gives us good data to use as teachers, but it also gives us the opportunity for that concrete data that will allow us to have better informed instructional practices based on that concrete data that comes from formative assessments. So now that we've talked a little bit about how formative assessment benefits teachers, let's talk about how formative assessment benefits students. There has been a lot of research done in this area of late because formative assessment has become so popular in the educational realm. First of all, we also know that brain research has become another very popular topic of conversation in the educational realm. And from that brain research, I got this quote from Jensen's book, Teaching with the Brain in Mind, where it says the rule of error correction or trial and error learning is based on two simple truths about the brain. The brain rarely gets it right the first time, and two, making mistakes is key to developing intelligence. Basically, our brain is built to learn from its mistakes. It doesn't learn automatically the first time, and very rarely will it get it right that first time. Students need the opportunity to practice a lot and learn from those mistakes. They need the opportunity for that formative assessment because it tells them, here's where you were wrong, here's how you can correct it. If the student A does never realize that they were wrong, or B does never understand how to correct that mistake, then they won't actually be able to learn. They'll only either get frustrated and stop trying, or B continue to do something wrong, not understanding that they have to reteach their brain how to perform that particular item. Another benefit of formative assessment helps, I should say, students to detect the knowledge gaps that they need to overcome. Basically, it allows for students to see where they are missing information. Formative assessment is really key to helping students learn the process of self-assessment, which we as teachers know is important because without self-assessment and self-reflection, we won't be able to get better as teachers. This is an important life skill that students need to be able to understand, and formative assessment is the key to providing them that opportunity. When they're able to look at their own work, and this would be an example of a higher level thinking skill, are able to self-assess and see, this is where I didn't get it quite right. This is where I can improve. Here's where I'm doing well. Here's where I can improve even in those areas. And that helps, like I said, to develop critical thinking. It also helps to develop the skills that the teacher is trying to assess in that particular moment. Research shows that when teachers provide quality feedback and students act on that feedback, learning improves. Again, teachers benefit from this, students benefit from this. When a teacher is able to give good feedback and the student is able to receive and then act on it, it helps both parties and the classroom environment becomes a more positive one because everybody's on the same page. Students like to know what target they're shooting for. They like to know this is the outcome that my teacher expects. Here's how I can get to that outcome. That's why rubrics and things like that are so important. And with formative assessment, it allows kids to continuously check, how am I doing? Okay, this is working, this isn't, let's fix it. And it provides such an important element to the classroom environment where everybody is in this understanding of, hey, mistakes happen, but let's all learn from it together and see how we can get better. Winston Churchill once said that success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. This is really key to our classrooms because we have to ask the question, how can we as teachers help motivate students to learn after meeting with failure? We know that they're going to meet with failure because we know that brain research tells us they're not going to succeed the first time. Through the use of formative assessment, we can help students face that failure and then move on from failure to failure until they are able to find success. What does that look like exactly? How do we use that type of formative assessment? What are some strategies that I can use in my classroom? Those are all the types of questions that you want to think about as we continue to move through this presentation. And especially, how can I use formative assessment in my classroom? what strategies specifically will be useful to me in what I do. Every classroom is different, and as we move into this next part of the presentation, you may find some things that really work well and some things that might not work as well in your classroom. It's up to you as the teacher to know what motivates your students and help them to find not only extrinsic motivation by achieving good grades and such, but also intrinsic motivation of, yes, I want to be successful in this classroom. That is the motivation that ultimately we want to provide for our students through the use of formative assessments. Okay, so you're going to need that note card again or that piece of paper and then your writing utensil, whatever it might be, because I want to just take a moment here and pause. We've covered a lot of information so far. We've talked about what formative assessment is, how it's different from summative assessment. We've talked about how formative assessment benefits teachers. We've talked about how formative assessments benefit students. We've talked about what success should look like in the classroom as we motivate our students through the use of formative assessment. So what I want you to do is, again, once I finish giving instructions, you're going to pause the video and take 30 seconds, a minute, whatever you think you need, to jot down some things you've learned and also some questions that you still have. I threw out a few of them as we were just discussing on the last slide about things that you might be thinking about in terms of how can I use this in my classroom. But jot down, first of all, things that you've learned and questions that you still have. And we'll see if we can answer some more of those as we move through this presentation. All right, so you ready? Remember, you're going to pause the video. You're going to write down things you've learned and questions that you still have. All right, ready, set, go. All right, did you do it? Remember, you are supposed to write down things that you learned and questions that you still have. Hopefully, we'll be able to answer some of those questions as we continue to move through the presentation. So, the first question that we're going to talk about here is, what does formative assessment look like? We've talked about what it is, but what does it look like in the classroom? One really important thing to talk about as we look at formative assessment is timing. Timing is a key factor when considering how to implement formative assessment. We as teachers have to ask ourselves two different questions. How soon do we assess, and how often do we assess? Studies show that for the most part, immediate feedback is very beneficial to students. They like to get that instant result of, yes, I did this right, no, I didn't do this right. The only time that that wouldn't be the case is if it's going to actually hurt their motivation. That would be like if you tell them all of the things that they're doing wrong right after they've just turned something in. That would not be an excellent immediate feedback. But for the most part, immediate or very soon thereafter. That's why it's so important to keep up to date with our grades and things, because the sooner that students get feedback, the sooner they can implement it. If we don't allow them the feedback before they have to practice that skill again, then the formative assessment has been wasted because the student hasn't been able to benefit from it, even if we as teachers have. And then the other question is, how often do we assess? And that question kind of depends on what you're doing, what you're trying to teach, and what your goals are. You maybe need to assess every day in a particular subject, especially if it's new or something that is very difficult for students. Maybe you don't have to assess every day, but you do have to assess often enough that you can make changes if necessary. So making sure that you assess after you've shared a key chunk of information would be important in this instance. You as a teacher are going to have to play a little bit with how soon and how often, but those are the two questions that you want to ask yourself as you look at formative assessment. You have to think of it a little bit like trying to keep plants alive. Also not an excellent skill set of mine. I have a tendency to overwater or underwater. See, sometimes I look at the plant and I think, oh, I need to water it. And I water it too soon. Then it dies because I watered it too much. But on the other hand, if I don't pay attention and I don't check the dirt to see if the plant needs water, I can go very long before I remember, oh, yeah, I need to water that plant. And unfortunately, by that point, it's too late. The plant can't come back if it goes too long without being watered. Students are the same way. We can't overwater them, meaning we can't give them too much assessment or too much feedback too soon, but we can't underwater them either. They need that formative assessment in order to keep moving and making adequate progress within our classrooms. So again, we're back to that idea of brain research. And again, from Jensen, the neural connections are made more efficient by feedback-driven learning. They are made stronger by usage. What that means is that when we allow students to benefit from formative assessment, the neural connections in their brain are made more efficient because they can root out the problems sooner. However, those neural connections are made stronger by usage. We have to allow time for students to practice with the skills that they are learning. That's part of the benefit of formative assessment. We can look and see, okay, here's the areas that students are needing more practice in, and then we can give it to them. However, the flip side of that is that excessive practice of a skill can become monotonous, so the repetition has to be interesting. This is where we as teachers get to be creative with our learning strategies. We get to utilize other forms of assessment or repetition through things like music integration or physical movement. There's a whole lot of brain research that has been done with both of those aspects, actually, music and physical movement, and how they activate different parts of your brain and help to sequence the learning faster and more efficiently. Again, it's all about those neural connections and how they're able to work more efficiently for our students. And so as teachers, when we use formative assessment, we can't just use the same tool all the time. We have to use a wide variety. On the next slide, I'm going to give you several different types and examples of formative assessment that you can use in your classroom. And the idea is don't pick just one and use that all the time. Then it becomes boring and the students don't engage their brain anymore. You have to try new things all the time, and there are always new ideas for formative assessment that become available as time goes on. So just be willing to experiment and try different things. So here's a whole bunch of different types of formative assessments that you can use in your classroom. They're all super easy and don't require a lot of work on your part, and they're kind of fun and different for students as well. One idea that will require a little work on your part is the idea of entrance and exit slips. Sometimes they're called bell ringers, sometimes they're called warm-ups. Exit slips are usually called exit slips. But the idea is that you're asking students to reflect on their learning that day. Maybe you've got some key points that tie in with your learning outcomes, and you're asking students to demonstrate their knowledge of those things. Then you as the teacher get to look at those entrance and exit slips and see, where did students hit the target, where did they miss the mark, and move from there. They're super easy. Maybe it's post-it notes or note cards. Maybe you actually do have something like a form that you type up and use. Whatever works for you in your classroom, but that's one idea. One strategy that I use for quick assessment in my classroom is the idea of thumbs up, thumbs down, and actually thumbs sideways. Thumbs up if you understand, thumbs down if you don't, thumbs sideways if you're not quite sure. Don't use this if you're afraid that students are going to be embarrassed or whatever because they do or don't understand something. I didn't use it all the time, but especially when it was something that I was kind of reviewing and maybe it wasn't new information, I didn't want to belabor it if students felt like they already knew. So I could look real quick. I didn't have them leave it up for very long. It wasn't like I was counting like, oh, 7 out of 15 students understood. And, no. It's just a real quick glance. Okay, I've got most of my thumbs are up. That means I'm probably okay, but I'm going to pay attention to the couple that have their thumbs down, their thumbs sideways, because it means I might have to do some follow-up work with them a little later to get them on the same level as the other students. Another strategy that you can use is think, pair, share. Ask a question, have students think about it. It's always really important to give students think time. Again, brain research shows that students need that settling time where they're not learning new information or taking in new information, but just thinking and processing the information they've already learned. So have them think about it, give them a time, and then have them pair up with somebody and share with their partner, and then allow opportunity for the partner or the group to share with either the class or with another group of students what they discussed and talked about. Again, you're reinforcing things as they move from themselves to now they've gotten to share to now they've gotten to share again. And all of those things provide reinforcement. It also provides formative assessment for you as you walk around the classroom. You'll notice a common theme with several of these is the idea that you as a teacher have to be walking around and observing and interacting with students or just listening depending on the activity because it's focusing on another 21st century skill, collaboration and critical thinking skill of collaboration discussion, where students are able to work in groups to achieve this formative assessment. So that was think, pair, share. Another option is this strategy called give one, get one. Again, it's going to make use of note cards or post-it notes, whatever works. I've done it with both. You have the student write down a thought or answer to the question or whatever it might be, and then they're going to share it with somebody, and then they're actually going to trade cards. And so they're going to end up with their partner's card. And you have them go through several of these different things, and so the students are not only going to share their thought, but they're also practicing how to share somebody else's thought, because once they get that new note card, they have to share that new thought with somebody else. Then they're going to come back to maybe their table group or whatever the case may be and share the outcome of all the different thoughts that they got to share with all the different note cards that they've been trading back and forth. That one's kind of fun. Again, gets students up and moving, which is always a benefit, that physical movement thing that we talked about earlier. Students like that one because they get to talk with each other, which is always fun, and move around. Another one that is similar to the idea of partners, or similar to the idea of think, pair, share, pardon, is the idea of partners and quartets. Have kids share with their partner, and then have that partner group share with another partner group so that you go from 2 to 4. Again, it's allowing them to share, it's allowing them to process. You as a teacher get to watch how they interact as students. It's working on that collaboration thing, but it also takes off some of the stress of having to share with the whole classroom. So that's kind of a nice alternative to the think, pair, share idea. And then the last one that I've gotten here is called focus reading. This one's not a collaborative one. This one is more like if you hand a student an article or a short piece of reading that you're wanting them to do in class or for homework or whatever the case may be, have them make markings along the side, highlighters in different colors or whatever works for your kids, about things that they know, things that they thought were interesting, things that they didn't understand. And they can use whatever symbols work. Maybe a check mark for things they understand, an exclamation mark for, wow, that was interesting, question mark for, hey, I didn't really understand that. And then if they turn it into you as a teacher, you get that feedback. Otherwise, again, a lot of formative assessment is asking students to look and self-assess on where they're at with their learning. And especially in terms of this focused reading thing, it allows them to look at their reading comprehension. How much of what they're reading are they understanding? That can be a very useful skill for them and for you as a teacher to get practice with. So I mentioned collaboration a lot in that last slide. Aside from collaboration, 21st century skills are really, really popular and a buzzword in today's educational community. This article that I've got here, also posted in the information or about section below so that you can check it out. This is just a blog that's got some ideas on different resources that you can use that are 21st century technology skills, but also allow you to use formative assessment. I have had experience with a couple of these. I like Kahoot. It's a game-based competitive thing. If you've got one-to-one going on in your classroom, kids can use their classrooms to participate. It's fun. We used to use it with vocab in my classroom. Another example is Ed Puzzles. It allows for you to kind of stop students as they're watching videos, interact with the material, answer questions as they go through again, comprehension, seeing how much they're understanding, all that kind of thing. So go and check this out, and then just feel free to look on social media, the internet, wherever you find your resources, Pinterest. Um, Check out the different resources that teachers are using. You may find that some of them really work well in your classroom and some of them don't, and that's okay. Just be willing to try and experiment with new things. Like I said, you can't use, for example, I discovered I can't use Kahoot all the time because even though it's a game and it's fun, the kids who don't win just because they aren't fast enough, this does not become their preferred form of assessment. Fun every once in a while, not all the time. You have to keep those neural connections forming and firing by using different resources. So go check it out. Check out these resources, check out your other resources. Just be willing to experiment and try new things in terms of technology in your classroom. So, all right, here we go. The teacher is the chief learner in the classroom. You have learned a lot today. At least I hope you've learned a lot today. There's been a lot of information that's been thrown at you. Now it's time to kind of think and process. How are you going to use formative assessment in your classroom? That's the question that I've got for you. Again, you can write it down on your note card or blank sheet of paper. I would encourage you to go and talk to somebody, maybe a fellow teacher, maybe an administrator, maybe a friend, whatever the case may be. Talk to them about formative assessment. How are you going to use what you've learned in your classroom today? Maybe take a few minutes after this video is done to jot down some ideas that you liked, go back, look up some resources, say, hey, I really liked that, and not so sure about that. Whatever the case may be, this is your opportunity to assess and see how you are going to use this information as you move forward as a teacher. Continue to be a learner. That's how you will continue to grow as a teacher. Thank you so much for stopping by my YouTube video today. I hope that you've learned some things about formative assessment. I hope that you've walked away with some tools that you'll be able to use in your classroom. Be sure and check out some of the resources that I mentioned. Go and search out and find your own resources. Remember, formative assessment is all about providing kids that motivation to continue to succeed in your classroom. There are a lot of benefits for both us as teachers and them as students. It allows for them to grow as long as we do it in a timely fashion and make use of the brain research that's available to us by knowing that we have to use different strategies and not use the same thing all the time, and not be afraid as teachers to use technology. All of those things together will make formative assessment a really useful tool in your classroom, beneficial to you and your students. Thanks so much. Have a great day.